Next we're going to cover section 10.4. This is factoring in order to solve quadratic equations. And we're going to talk about the zero product property. The zero product property says that for every real number a and b, if multiplied together they equal 0, then one of the two has to equal 0. Right? So if a is 0, it doesn't matter what b is, because 0 times anything is 0. And if b is 0, it doesn't matter what a is. So if this product, these two things multiply to be 0, then one of those two terms has to be 0. That's what the zero product property is. And these are our main steps here. First thing is to set the equation equal to 0. That's our first step. Our second step is to look for the greatest common factor. Always look for a greatest common factor first. Number 3, step 3, is to factor the trinomial. And remember, this is where, at least at LSN, we split the middle. And then number 4, after we've got it all factored, we set each factor equal to 0 to find the solutions to the quadratic. So the first example has worked out completely for us. We have x squared plus 6x plus 8. It's already set equal to 0. That part's already been done. There's no greatest common factor, so there's no step 2. 3 is to factor the trinomial. And our factors of 8 that multiply to be 8 and add to be 6. Remember, if you're in Mrs. Reisinger's class, we do a times c and b. My a is 1, my c is 8, my b term is 6. And the two numbers that multiply to be 8 and add to be 6 are 2 and 4. So those are the two factors that are in our factored trinomial. Then what you do is you take each factor and you set it equal to 0. And then you solve for x. So take this parentheses, put it equal to 0, and then you get x by itself. You subtract 2 from both sides, I get x equals negative 2. Here I subtract 4 from both sides and got x equals negative 4. All right, so let's try this on a new solution, or new example. First thing I'm going to do is set this equal to 0. That's step 1. Step 2 would be to look for greatest common factor. I don't see a greatest common factor there. So we get to move on. I'm going to split the middle to factor the trinomial. So my numbers, my a times c is negative 28. Don't forget your negative signs. My b term is a positive 3. So I need two numbers that multiply to be negative 8 and add to be positive 3. What we remember is that if this is negative, one of these two terms has to be negative in order for that to be negative. So I'm really subtracting those numbers. The factors of 28 are 1 and 28. 2 goes into 28 14 times. 3 doesn't go. 4 goes into 28 7 times. 5 doesn't go, 6 doesn't go, and we're back to 7. So these are the only factor pairs. And it looks like these two, 4 and 7, would subtract to be 3. So it's going to be 4 and 7. I want the positive on the 7 and the negative on the 4 so that I get the positive 3. And that's what I'm going to split this middle term into. These are the coefficients of this x term. So now we have x squared minus 4x plus 7x minus 28. My next step is going to be to factor by grouping. So I look at each of those two sets. On this I can take out an x. X times x gives me x squared. X times minus 4 gives me negative 4x. Here this is a plus, which means I'm factoring out a positive number. And I can take a 7 out of 7 and 28. And I'm left with x minus 4 inside the parentheses. I'm going to take this and factor it out. That's going to be one of my parentheses. And then I'm left with x and plus 7 in the second parentheses. And then remember, our final step is once we've got it factored, we take each of these and set them equal to 0. So I have x minus 4 equals 0 and x plus 7 equals 0. To get x by itself, I would add 4 to both sides. So my x is a positive 4. That's one solution. On this one, I would subtract 7 from both sides. So my x is negative 7. That's another solution. And I'm all finished. So let's try that on this one. Okay, first thing I'm going to do is set it equal to 0. It's already set equal to 0. I don't have a greatest common factor, so I'm going to have to split the middle. My a times c is 1 times negative 48, which is negative 48. My b term is a negative 8. And I need two numbers that multiply to be negative 48 and add to be positive, or add to be negative 8. So I'm going to list my factor pairs for 48. I have 1 and 48, 2 and 24, 3 goes into 48 16 times, 4 goes into it 12 times, 5 does not go into 48, 6 goes into 48 8 times, 7 does not go into it, and I'm back at 8. So these are all my factor pairs. And the ones that will multiply to be negative 48 and add to be negative 8, looks like I'm using 4 and 12, and the negative goes on the 12 so that I get the negative 8. These two numbers are the new coefficients for my middle term. That's what I'm going to split my middle term into, these two terms. That's why it's called split the middle. So I have x squared plus 4x minus 12x minus 48. And if you had them in a different order, if you had negative 12 and positive 4, and you had them in a different order here, you will still get to the same answer eventually. So don't stress about which order those two middle terms go in. It'll still get to the same place. Okay, I'm going to factor by grouping. I can factor an x out of this, and I'm left with x plus 4, because x times x is x squared, x times 4 is 4x. If this is a negative, then I'm factoring out a negative. And I can factor out a 12 out of both of those. Make sure you're getting the biggest thing out that you can. Negative 12 times x will give me the negative 12x. Negative 12 times positive 4 will give me the negative 48. I'm going to factor out my x plus 4, and I'm left with x minus 12. And once you have it factored, you take each factor and set it equal to 0. So x plus 4 equals 0, x minus 12 equals 0. I'm going to subtract 4 from both sides, and I get x equals negative 4. That's one of my solutions. And on this side, I'm adding 12 to both sides, and I get x equals positive 12. And that's my other solution. So those are my two solutions for that particular example. Okay, we're going to do a couple more here and make sure we've got the hang of this. Okay, now those original ones were already set equal to 0. This one's not. I've got an equal sign, and it's not set equal to 0. So I'm going to add 10 to both sides to get this over to the left so that I can have this whole thing equal to 0. So I have 3x squared minus 11x plus 10 equals 0. You cannot factor it unless it's set equal to 0 first. Okay, so now that I've got a trinomial equal to 0, I'm going to split the middle. Okay, my a times c, 3 times, oops, and look at our trinomial, 3 times positive 10 is a positive 30. So I need numbers that multiply to be positive 30 and add to be negative 11. So I'm going to list my factors of 30. I've got 1 and 30, 2 goes into 30 15 times, 3 goes into 30 10 times, 4 does not go into 30, 5 goes 6 times, and now we're at 6, and those are all my options. If I have a negative 5 and a negative 6, those will add to be negative 11 and multiply to be positive 30. So that's what I'm going to split this middle into. So I have 3x squared minus 5x minus 6x plus 10, and that's equal to 0. I'm going to factor by grouping, group this and group this. Out of this I can take an x, and I'm left with 3x minus 5. Remember, whatever this sign is what I'm factoring out in the second group. So I'm factoring out a negative. I can take a 2 out of both 6 and 10. Negative 2 times 3 gives me the negative 6x, and negative 2 times a negative 5 will give me a positive 10. I'm going to factor this common factor out, and when I do, what I'm left with is x minus 2. I've got it factored. Now set each factor equal to 0. And this one's going to look a little bit different. I've got 3x minus 5 equals 0, and x minus 2 equals 0. And I'm going to do the easy one first. This one I'm going to add 2 to both sides, so I have x equals positive 2. That's one of my solutions. The other solution over here, I need to solve for x. I'm going to add 5 to both sides. So I have 3x equals 5. I'm dividing both sides by 3, so I get x equals 5/3. And I'd like you to leave them, if you are in Mrs. Rice in your class, I like to leave it as a fraction, that's simplified. So check with your teacher and see if you can do it as a decimal or leave it as a fraction. If that was a decimal, it would be 1.67 or 1.7. But check with your teacher. And then those are my two solutions. So let's try another one. Okay, first thing I've got to do is set this equal to 0. Done. All right, the next step that we haven't had yet is looking for a greatest common factor. And this time I do have a greatest common factor. I can factor a 2 out. So I have 2 times x squared. 2 times 2x gives me 4x. And 2 times negative 15 gives me 30. Now I'm looking at just this trinomial. And if I'm going to split the middle of this, and again, I factored out the 2, so I'm only looking at this part. This is 1 times negative 15 is a negative 15 up top. My b term is a positive 2. And it looks like that's going to be a positive 5 and a negative 3 that will multiply to be negative 15 and add to be positive 2. If you don't see that right away, just make sure that you list your factor pairs so that you can figure that out. So that's what I'm factoring my 2x into. So I have x squared. The 2x is going to go to 5x and negative 3x. And then I have the minus 15. Okay, I'm just going to focus on factoring this part. I'm going to factor by grouping. I can take an x out of this, so I have x times x plus 5. I'm factoring out a negative down here. I can take a 3 out of both of these. Negative 3 times x gives me negative 3x. Negative 3 times positive 5 will give me negative 15. I take this common factor and I factor it out. So I have x plus 5 times x minus 3. Don't forget though, I factored out a 2. That's still one of the factors. Okay, so if this is truly completely factored, don't forget this greatest common factor that you pulled out, because that is still a factor. Now I'm going to set each of these factors equal to 0. Well, when I set 2 equal to 0, that's not true. That doesn't make sense, so I can just cross it out. I have x plus 5 equals 0. I'm going to subtract 5 from both sides, and I get x equals negative 5. That's a solution. And x minus 3 equals 0. Add 3 to both sides, and x equals 3. And those are my two solutions. It doesn't matter what order you have them in, as long as you've got them both listed. Okay, let's go down again. We're going to do another one on number 5. This time it's already set equal to 0. I look at 5 and 31 and 6, and I do not have a common factor there. So I can go straight to split the middle. My a times c is my 5 times 6, which is 30. My b term is 31. So the numbers that multiply to be 30 and add to be 31 are 1 and 30. That multiplies to be 31 and 30 and adds to be 31. So that's what I'm splitting this middle term into. Those are my new coefficients. So I have 5x squared plus, I'll do it in the same order just so I don't confuse it. It'd be plus 1x plus 30x, okay, right? Because these are my new coefficients, plus 6. I'm going to split the middle. I'm going to factor by grouping. I already split the middle. I'm going to take an x out of this, and I'm left with 5x plus 1, because x times 5x gives me 5x squared. X times 1 gives me x. I'm factoring out a positive number on this side, and for 30 and 6, I can factor out a 6. 6 times 5x will give me 30x. 6 times 1 will give me 6. I'm going to factor the 5x plus 1 out, and I'm left with x plus 6. And then our last step is to set each of these equal to 0. So I have 5x plus 1 equals 0. Subtract 1 from both sides. So I have 5x equals negative 1. Get the x by itself, I've got to divide by 5. So I have x equals negative 1/5. That's one of my solutions. Okay, remember the world does not work in integers. Sometimes you're going to have fractions or decimals, and that's okay. On this other side, though, I have x plus 6 equals 0. I'm going to subtract 6 from both sides, so x equals negative 6. And that's my second solution. Okay, we have one more that we're going to do for today. That's number 6. Always remember step 1 is to set it equal to 0. So I'm going to add 36 to both sides so I can get 0 on the right hand side here. I have x squared minus 12x plus 36 equals 0. I'm going to split the middle. X, 1 times 36 is 36. My b term is negative 12. So if I list my factors of 36, I know by looking at this, 6 times 6 is 36 and adds to be 12, so I'm going to use negative 6 and negative 6. And that's what I'm splitting my middle into. So I have x squared minus 6x minus 6x. I have two of those. And then plus 36 equals 0. Factor by grouping. I can take an x out of this first group, so I have x minus 6. This is a negative, so I'm factoring out a negative. And I can take 6 out of 6x and 36. Negative 6 times x gives me negative 6x. Negative 6 times negative 6 gives me positive 36. This is in common, so I'm going to factor that out. So I have x minus 6. What's left is another x minus 6. So when I set these equal to 0, I have x minus 6 equals 0, and x minus 6 equals 0. I have 6 to both sides. I get x equals 6. If I had 6 to both sides over here, I get x equals 6. These are the same answer. So I don't have two solutions. I really just have the one solution, and that's that x equals positive 6. All right, that's all we have today for section 10.4. Thanks.